Alright, good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion in Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting conscientious emergence. Alright, I was just piddling around with the clownfish, getting him a little more rendered. The white band around his face was still a little wonky. I got that cleaned up a little bit, and as well as the smoothness of the orange of his face and some other just minor detailing of that. For the next step on this, I want to push that castle further into the background, so I'm going to take a very light, thin, translucent glaze of red ochre and alizarin crimson and just glaze over pretty much this whole area around the plant and back behind this hill, just to give that a little bit more pushback. And then I think we'll put a face in the moon. Just small details refining right now before I move on to any other subject matter that may develop into the painting.
In the deepest depths of our nonviolent love justice tradition.
Bishop William Barber, I want to thank you so much for being with us, speaking to us from North Carolina. Coming up next, veteran war crimes prosecutor Reed Brody on Nicaragua, from the terror of the U.S.-backed Contras 40 years ago to the abuses of the Ortega government today. Back in 30 seconds.
That little figure was still so fresh. Put her back.
2000, Black's Gotta Be Free by Fela Kuti and Roy Ayers. Composer, musician, and producer Ayers passed away this week at the age of 84. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to Nicaragua, which is withdrawn from the United Nations Human Rights Council following a report last month that urged the international community to address human rights violations by President Daniel Ortega's government. This is the Commission's chair, John Michael Simon.
All right, they needed a little reinforcing anyway.
Serious human rights violations have been and continue to be committed in Nicaragua, requiring urgent global action.
Excelencies, desde abril.
Excellencies, since April 2018, President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo have implemented a repressive strategy to ensure absolute control of the state.
Para asegurarse el control absoluto del Estado. El grupo ha concluido que
The group has concluded that the repressive apparatus is controlled by President Ortega and Vice President Murillo, with direct support from high-level officials in all branches of government, as well as party members. The chains of command have been well designed and are managed in a tentacle-like fashion, with the intention of ensuring direct control of various links at different levels in the execution of centralized strategies.
Today also marks 40 years since the release of the 1985 fact-finding report, Contra Terror in Nicaragua, which laid out how U.S. policy attempted to destabilize Nicaragua through a campaign of terror directed at its people by funding the Contras. President Ronald Reagan described the Contras at the time as, quote, the moral equal of our founding fathers, sending millions of dollars in funding to the Contras. The testimony of the victims of Contra attacks in the 1985 fact-finding report made it to the front page of the New York Times and exposed the policy of torture, murder, rape, kidnapping, and violence used by the Contras. We're joined now by the author of that report, veteran war crimes prosecutor Reed Brody, who quit his job at the New York State Attorney General's office at the time, spending months traveling through the war zones of Nicaragua collecting people's stories. Reed Brody was recently appointed to the UN Commission investigating contemporary abuses in Nicaragua, which presented their findings last week at the UN Human Rights Council. Reed, thanks so much for being with us today. Talk about your presentation last week at the UN Human Rights Council, just in the days before Nicaragua left the council.
So, 40 years after my report on terror by the Contras,
I think I'm going to take that tone a little lower and kind of wrap that hill around the shadow.
Commission looking at abuses in contemporary Nicaragua. And unfortunately what we found is that the government of Daniel Ortega and his wife Rosario Murillo have step by step eliminated all checks and balances on their power. Today in Nicaragua, there are no independent voices. There is no independent press. All of the NGOs have had to leave the country. 453 Nicaraguans have had their citizenships taken away. Former Sandinista commanders, the former vice president, human rights activists, former presidential candidates. Nicaragua has become a country of enforced silence and surveillance for those who stay in the country. And while those who dare to speak out face a life of exile and denationalization.
Let's talk about how this happened. I want you to go back in time, especially for young people, to understand how momentous it was for the Sandinistas to take over. And you did this stunning report 40 years ago today about the violence of the Contras. Talk about what came next, the rise of Daniel Ortega, hailed as finally democracy in Nicaragua.
Right, so 40 years ago, I went to Nicaragua. Like many people of our generation, we were excited by the Sandinista revolution, which had overthrown decades of US-backed family dictatorship under the Somozas. And I went to Nicaragua with a colleague from the Attorney General's office whose brother was a parish priest in a little village in Nicaragua. And in that village, I came face to face with people who saying, you know, the Contras, this US-backed, that the US had armed and financed remnants of Somoza's National Guard to fight against, to try to undermine the Sandinista revolution, which had begun literacy programs, health care for the poor, doctors in rural areas. But the US was funding these Contras who were destroying all of that. And in this little village, I came face to face with victims of those attacks who said, you have to go back and do something. You have to tell American people what's going on here. And so I came back to New York. I quit my job at the New York State Attorney General's office, and I returned to Nicaragua and spent 5 months crisscrossing the war zones of Nicaragua and taking hundreds of testimonies and put those testimonies together in a report. And I came back to Washington just as Ronald Reagan was seeking assistance to the Contras and calling them the moral equals of our founding fathers. And my report detailed these widespread atrocities, rapes, murders, burning of schools and hospitals, and it concentrated enough minds in a divided Congress to deny assistance to the Contras. I was attacked by President Reagan as a Sandinista sympathizer, but my report was used by the Nicaraguan government also in its historic case against the United States that condemned at the International Court of Justice.
All right, that gives a little more depth and play of light in the
So we only
background.
have 3 minutes, and you
Now
have
let's zoom up
exposed so much
to the moon
back then and
and
also
up zoom
today.
in to the moon.
Particular part of the report that has
knobs, right?
been so
There we go.
important to so many was what happened in 2018. And talk about the co-presidents today.
So,
Let's see what we can do with
the Sandinistas lost the election in 1990. Daniel Ortega then started purging the Sandinista party, kept running for president. Finally, in 2007, he became
Already got
president
some
again.
nice
and began
variation
to
of tone in it.
dismantle all
I've
the
just got
checks
some
and
very
balances,
thin linseed oil and
his-
Prussian
his-
blue
his wife,
mixed up.
Rosario Murillo became
I'll just play
co-president.
with some features.
We noted that Rosario's daughter,
That's not bad.
Zoila America Narvaez, accused Daniel Ortega
Take it
of
up
having
higher,
raped
maybe.
her repeatedly for many years. Rosario Murillo took her husband's side against her daughter, and at that point began to rise in power to become vice president. And then just 2 weeks ago, a new constitution was adopted in which she is, now you have a male president and a female co-president. There's a male co-president and female. And all the other powers of the state have become mere organs to be coordinated by the presidency. So the last vestiges of checks and balances have been sacrificed at the altar of this now a family. I mean, Daniel Ortega, the man who fought against a family dynasty, the Somosas, has now created a situation where he and his wife are co-presidents, and they can name their kids as vice presidents.
So we have just 1 minute. What happened in 2018?
So in 2018, there was the protest first against the Social Security reform, and then it became a much wider protest. And the government of Ortega Murillo decided to go at them with everything. And they brought out the police, paramilitaries, and as we have shown in our latest report, the military.
Which they denied at the time.
And our report now, based on insider testimony, shows that the military participated in this repression, and over 350 people were killed. And that was really the beginning of what we see until today, in which progressively all of the voices in the country, unfortunately, have been silenced.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Reed. We will link to your report presented that you presented with the others at the UN Human Rights Council. Again, right before that report was presented, Nicaragua pulled out of the Human Rights Council. Veteran war crimes prosecutor Reed Brody. I'll be moderating a panel at South by Southwest Festival in Austin this Saturday at 4 p.m. discussing the premiere of the HBO short documentary Armed Only with a Camera, The Life and Death of Brent Renaud, a film by Craig Renaud about his brother Brent, who was killed by a Russian sniper while reporting in Ukraine on March 13th, 2022. It is executive produced by DCTV's John Alpert. For more information, you can see the South by Southwest website. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guster, Messiah Rhodes, Anjali Comet, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Tarasena, Tammy Warnoff. To see all information about activities, go to democracynow.org.
Thank you.
And expensive.
I think well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, it may be true in some regards.
It's a different level of.
Well, but Steve, the new guy who heads the war on drugs, Martinez, this guy, I heard him on NPR this week, and his most passionate moment in the half-hour interview was he said, "We have pushed the price of an ounce of cannabis past the price of an ounce of gold, and we're going to keep it that way." Nothing about eradication. Talk about keeping the price high.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the government's concerned, I mean, they're spending billions of dollars a year to prosecute and incarcerate drugs and specifically marijuana, not to mention the lost revenue that they could obtain by simply taxing it, which they would if it were available to those people who didn't have the wherewithal to grow it themselves.
Right, the fact that they refuse to tax it when they're starving for revenue shows that there must be a secret agenda. It doesn't make any kind of sense.
Something else going on there too is that if you have a government which needs to do many, many things which are untraceable, as soon as you put money into it, it's traceable. But drugs provide a really nice source of untraceable money. That's all okay.
Yeah, that's another level, and we might as well say a little bit about that. When I wrote this book, I did a lot of research and about area I didn't know that much about, which is, let's say, from 1500 to the present, drugs of addiction. And what I discovered is drug smuggling is like assassination. If the government isn't involved, it never seems to really happen. And governments have been using drugs for centuries as forms of secret revenue. This whole sugar thing that I laid out to you, those were decisions made by the crown heads of Europe in collusion with the Pope. It wasn't common people who set those policies in place. During the 1960s, when the black ghettos began to come apart, suddenly number 3 China white heroin was cheaper and more available than it had ever been at any time in the history of the heroin problem in the United States. Why? Because the CIA saw, all these black guys are getting up, a bunch of uppity niggers, as the government calls them. You just smother it in heroin. Get everybody either hooked or making money, and they're not...
I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. If that's your agenda, there's no better way to go about it. It's just like you could invent a better drug than crack.
That's right.
Just distract these people and just have them killing each other and not messing with, the real...
And they don't care really about the effect of drugs, and one group, one faction will work against another. For example, I'm a great aficionado of hashish, and hashish became very hard to get in the United States in the late 70s. But as soon as the Russians invaded Afghanistan, suddenly there was massive amounts of excellent Afghani hashish at prices that nobody had seen for 15 years. The reason was the CIA knows that hashish it's not really a problem, but what they wanted is they wanted an income for the mujahideen, and they had to pay for all these weapons. So they just started bringing this in wholesale, and it wasn't even a smuggling operation. I mean, I received reports from people who said, smuggling? They're not smuggling. They're unloading it on Pier 39 with the stevedore Union Local 1030 is taking off, 500-pound blocks of hashish by the tens of thousands. And the day the Afghan war ended, they had staged an enormous series of interlocking busts on their own infrastructure, and they closed it down and they pulled it to pieces. When Khomeini kicked out the Shah, the Iranian heroin business then fell under the control of the mullahs, and at that point, suddenly, cocaine emerges as a major problem in the United States because we just switched our supply lines. We could no longer depend on Iranian heroin because we couldn't depend on these screwy Islamic fundamentalists, so we just turned toward all of these company assets in Honduras and Ecuador and Colombia. Very, very cynical. It's only been 120 years since the so-called Opium Wars. Very few people know what the Opium Wars, what was the issue in the Opium Wars. Well, it turns out the British government wanted to deal opium in China, and the Chinese emperor told them to get lost. And they flipped, and they sent naval units, and they laid siege to several Chinese cities, and they forced the Chinese imperial court to agree that they could deal as much opium as they wanted on the wharves of Shanghai.
I think it's a video game term. I don't know what you call that. I think that's for scrolling. I don't know if atmospheric perspective is for the word I'm going for there.
They had to go into the opium business. They're stealth.
So yeah, it gives a little haze over the castle and the middle ground, background area. Gets the moon, man in the moon, figure in the moon. Looks like a very disgruntled cafeteria worker. And what else we got here? Clownfish looking a little better.
And the Chinese were very smart.
Jellyfish looking a little better.
in the ports of China to the English.
A little step at a time with this one. It's going to take a while, but I like the idea, and so far the execution is turning out pretty well. So that's it for the moment, though. It's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting conscientious emergence. Thanks for watching, and have a good afternoon, Earth.